So this is one of the more interesting series of the first round, if you ask me, in terms of the storyline, where it's talent versus culture, almost, I guess. Because you have OKC, who is the more talented team. I mean, Westbrook's the best player in this series, and you could maybe say that Paul George is the second best. And then you've got, Utah, which is probably the most fundamentally sound team in the NBA. Quinn Snyder has a heavy motion offense. And, second best defensive team, Gobert is amazing, and Donovan Mitchell is Donovan Mitchell. And then if you look at Utah's fundamentals compared to OKC's, the Thunder are kind of a mess in comparison. So there's a lot of interesting things that are going to come to light in this. And I think where you could probably start with this is, how are the Jazz going to defend Russell Westbrook, right? Because Westbrook is good enough to win a series by himself. And I'll put a lot of time into Paul George as well, because he nearly won a series by himself against the Raptors a few years back with inferior talent. So he's good, but we're going to start with Russ. I mean, the first thing you do is just have Gobert back up on the pick and roll when Russ does it with Steven Adams, because Russ is liable to hoist up a mid-range jumper, and even if he's making mid-range jumpers, you would rather risk that going in than him getting to the basket, where he can put Gobert in foul trouble, or he could just finish, because he's obviously he's Russell Westbrook. I don't need to explain that. So I think that's step one. I don't think that's all you can do, because everybody goes under the screen on him. I think the next thing you do is you leave Corey Brewer open a lot, and you just dare him to beat you from outside. An interesting idea that I thought of is if Utah decides to have Derek Favors, quote-unquote, defend Corey Brewer, which means just allow him to linger around the basket and do whatever he wants, and then hope that Corey Brewer misses, which is what NBA teams have been doing to Corey Brewer for the last 7 years or so. Now, if Brewer's not making those threes, well, then you got yourselves a problem, and you might be forced to put Abrinas in the game just so it stretches out the Jazz defense, you know what I mean? Now, could Brewer surprise and make some threes or attack on closeouts? Yeah, it's possible. It's also possible that Quinn Snyder doesn't even have Favors defend him, and he has Favors on Melo. But I want to get back to Russ here. If Derek Favors really is on Corey Brewer at any point, then he can just be that extra body for Westbrook to have to go at. But regardless of who starts the game on Brewer, they're going to help off of him regardless. I think I just said regardless 3 times. So, yeah, Corey Brewer is going to be kind of important in this series, is what I'm getting at. Besides that, with Russ, I mean, you back up on the pick and roll, you bring the Corey Brewer defender. And I mean, if you look at the other guys in the Jazz, on the Thunder roster, I think you help off of Raymond Felton, you help off of Patrick Patterson. You just got to bring help and dare some of these guys to beat you from outside, And depending on how they're feeling, because those guys can be up and down in terms of their outside shots, you go from there as a defense. The next thing that we look at with the Westbrook stuff is Gobert, right? If all else fails, you still have Rudy Gobert to protect the basket. If there's anybody who can overcome Gobert over a 7-game series, it might be Westbrook. I do think Westbrook sometimes jumps at the basket without a real plan, and that works against a lot of centers. It's not going to work against Rudy. They'll probably meet in the middle somewhere. There's going to be some times when Westbrook makes Gobert look kind of silly, and there's other times when Westbrook is going to be surprised that, oh, this guy's really long arm is in the way and I can't score. The one interesting thing is I fear that Gobert might get a little too antsy with Westbrook, and he's going to leave Steven Adams open a few times. Or even if he doesn't leave Adams open on an initial dump-off pass, he'll force Westbrook to miss, and then Adams is going to be right there for the offensive rebound. So I think that's an interesting thing that you got to talk about with those two. That's just going to be really fun to see. The Westbrook-Gobert mind games are going to be something. What could also be interesting is whenever OKC gets a miss and Westbrook gets the board, if he just jets down in transition, he's not going to have to deal with Gobert a lot because the Jazz play at a very slow pace to accommodate Gobert, allow him to get into position on defense. But if you're just running up and down the floor all the time, then there you go. So those two are going to be good. That's what I'll say there. If we get to Paul George, they do run a lot of off-ball stuff for Paul George, and I think the Jazz have a decent amount of switchability between Ingles, Crowder, Rubio, Mitchell, Alec Burks, Dante Exum if he plays, Royce O'Neal. So I think they could be okay in that sense on the off-ball stuff. Now when it comes to the ISO game, once again, help off a Brewer. And actually, I've mentioned Alec Burks a couple times. He didn't really play that much down the stretch, so who knows if he really plays much at all for them. But yeah, besides helping off a Brewer, I think it's just knowing that you have a lot of like-sized players between Crowder and Ingles and Derek Favors if he's quick enough to where you can probably stay in front of Paul George enough, and then you got Gobert at the basket to finish the job. I mean, here's the thing, like Utah, they're just so good on defense that you would think that a team like this, like OKC, that's so ISO heavy, could really get themselves into trouble, where you just allow this really good defensive team to just kind of stay in place. You know, you're not forcing them to move from side to side. OKC doesn't have a big man who can really draw Gobert out of the paint. It's going to be tough. You know, I do think there could be some times when the Thunder's offense looks really bad in this series, so we'll just have to see. Now, of course, there's more to this than just the Jazz on defense. It's OKC on defense as well. If Robertson was not hurt, I think that would give OKC a much better chance here because, I mean, Utah's offense, a lot of the time, even with all the ball movement and all the player movement and all the handoffs and the screening and all that beautiful basketball, sometimes there is still like 6 seconds on the shot clock and they have nothing to do, and the ball ends up in Donovan Mitchell's hands and he bails them out of something. It's tough to maintain that in the postseason, right? And I do think OKC's defense is still good enough to extract that stuff, right? To where if you just load up on Mitchell and you don't leave Ingles and these guys completely wide open to where they can just shoot open threes, you might have a chance in terms of, you just getting good closeouts and things of that nature. The other part of all this is how are they going to defend Donovan Mitchell? Well, you leave Jay Crowder open. You dare him to beat you because his threes have been rough all season. Not just in Cleveland. They've been rough in Utah as well. The Jazz have pretty much figured out the Gobert Favors thing. A lot of it is dude sets screen on one side, other guy stands on like the opposite baseline, I guess. But there is still some chance for some rough spacing when those two are in the game. And you got to help off of Favors, you know. What's going to be interesting is who actually defends Derek Favors, because you could argue that Paul George will defend Mitchell. He probably won't do it for the entire series because you need Paul George's energy on offense and defense. So then maybe you put Corey Brewer on Mitchell, and then maybe Paul George ends up on Ingles and occasionally Mitchell. I mean, there's a decent chance that Carmelo Anthony gets the Derek Favors nod, and if that's the case, he might get beat up a bit. I mean, Melo's still pretty strong, but Favors might be a little too much for him down there, you know? Favors might be too much for all of them. It is going to be interesting because, OKC rolls with a perimeter-oriented 4, and Utah, at least to start the game, does not. So that is going to be an interesting thing. Yeah, there's a lot of elements to this series. Probably some that I haven't even totally thought of yet. For one, Alex Abrinas maybe just goes off from 3, and he ends up being the better option over Corey Brewer. Maybe Westbrook goes nuts from 3. Maybe Rubio plays really good defense on Westbrook. Maybe Melo can't miss from 3. Maybe Jay Crowder just starts making threes like crazy. So many different things that could happen in this. If I had to make a pick I think I have to go Utah in 7. The reason I say this is because I think Westbrook and Paul George are, it might get kind of rough because they're facing such a good defensive team, but I think they're going to be able to do what they need to do in terms of scoring and playmaking and all that. I think everybody else on OKC is going to have a really rough time. And you can have 2 guys play really well, but if nobody else can just put the ball in the basket, you're going to have a tough time. And I think the coaching difference it's not super drastic, because I think Donovan has grown into being at least an average coach, but I think Quinn Snyder is still decently better. And I think, they always say talent trumps everything in the end, right? Typically true, but I feel like this might be the one example where the talented team is so much worse than the other team in terms of strategy and X's and O's and ball movement and all that stuff, to where I'm I think I'm going to go with the less talented but more fundamentally sound team. Also, I just love Rudy Gobert, so there's that for you. I might be a little biased. There you go. I'm going with Utah, man. See, even after I say that, I think to myself, wow, I really just said that Westbrook and Paul George are going to go down in round 1. It doesn't sound right to say that, but that's just what I'm going with. Should be said, Donovan Mitchell is going to have to put up some real points in this thing, and that could be the downfall. Because eventually, you ask a rookie to just keep on going to the well, and eventually it might not happen for you. Whatever, I have to end this before I talk myself out of the Jazz in 7. Yeah, that's it. I'm done.